Welcome back, everybody. This is the third video in the off-grid system. This will be the second part of the battery part of the series. And if you haven't seen the first part, go back and watch it. We talk about the different types of batteries and what leads into this part of the discussion. So sometime back, I made a video about Pure Living for Life. If you haven't seen their channel, they're kind of a homesteaders up in northern Idaho who decided to go back on grid after being off grid for quite a while. And I gave them the thumbs up on that idea, especially since they're building a house. I caught some flack when I said you need to oversize your system if you're ever going to succeed with an off-grid system. And saying I oversized the system was probably not the exact right wording, but here's what I'm talking about. If you build your system to support 1 day of use, then what happens on the days when you don't have any sun or limited sun, or this time of year when there's only a few hours of sunlight? So your system needs to be built a little more robust. I know there's people that live down in Arizona, they have all the sun they need, so they don't really have to worry about that too much. Like living in the Pacific Northwest, you may have days, maybe even weeks of no sun or very limited sun. So you need to be prepared for days of autonomy. How many days can you survive without the sun? How many days do you want to survive without the sun? This becomes pretty critical. I recommend at least 2, maybe 3 days without the sun if you can. Now on certain, if you've got a high power requirement, that's a big set of batteries. That's a huge set of batteries. If you've got, say, 20 kilowatt hours per day usage, boy, you're talking a huge set of batteries there. Sometimes it comes down to, do I want a battery set that will give me several days of autonomy or maybe a week of autonomy from the sun? Or do I just plan on running a generator or whatever other power source you have? Something you really need to plan for ahead of time before you jump into this. Plan your system out and you'll be much happier with it down the road. Okay, with days of autonomy in mind, let's go through a little scenario on a 12-volt system and see how many amp hours of battery we would need to support our 7.9 kilowatt hours per day of usage. Now, this is figuring in 80% depth of discharge, not using the bottom 20% of your battery. So you're never going to get, if you treat your batteries good, you'll never dip into that last 20% of your battery capacity. So you're losing 20% right there. Because if you draw your batteries below that 80% depth of discharge, your lifespan will be greatly decreased. Here is an example of a chart of expected battery life. And this is using, I believe this is a Concord battery, the Sunxtender, which we've had excellent luck with. And you can see by this chart that if you start dipping in down in the bottom part of that depth of discharge, boy, you're going to really shorten your battery life. So if you can keep it, I recommend if you want a long-term battery solution, keep it up above 50%. But then there's the whole equation of if you keep it above 50%, you got to buy more batteries. And I am not sure it's makes any economic difference either way, whether you go down to 80% depth of discharge or 50%, because you're either buying a lot more batteries to start with or you're just replacing them sooner. So I'm not sure that works out long term. There's any cost savings either way, but headache wise, you'll have far less headache if you can keep it above 50%. Your lifespan will be longer on your batteries. Your batteries will treat you better. And so just keep that in mind, that never go below 80% depth of discharge. If you're getting down that low on your batteries, get those things charged with a generator or whatever other means you have, but don't let it dip down in there. So with that said, let's look at a 12-volt system, 3 days of autonomy, 3 days without sun, and never going below that 80% depth of discharge. What size of battery would you need? Well, you'll need about 2,468 amp hours of battery. That's a pretty sizable battery. Now, that's also assuming normal temperatures, like say 50 to 75 degrees, or a little warmer. So what happens if you're in a location or you have your batteries in a location that you can't keep them that warm. It dips down and they drop down to 32 degrees. Well, at 32 degrees, that same battery, now we're using the Concord extender for an example here. You can look up the chart for any battery you want. Most of it's online. So you would need 3,949 amp hours worth of battery. Again, same scenario, just changing the temperature. Now, say you're in a cold climate like around here, we dip down into -10, -20 once in a while. Not real often, but we do. Or you live in one of those climates that just stays that way for a while, and your battery temperature drops down. And I'm not talking about the ambient air temperature. I'm talking about the battery temperature itself. If it drops down and those batteries get down to 0 degrees, 5,503 amp hours worth of battery. That's a pretty sizable battery bank. Now there's a couple things you can do to help that. One, get your batteries in a vault type situation where they stay up around 50 degrees or more. Two, lower your power consumption, or run a generator so you don't have to deal with a huge battery bank. So that's what you're looking at for battery sizing. Now I'm going to link below to a spreadsheet I came up with. I altered it. I use it at work all the time for sizing our solar sites. I edited it for more of a off-grid home type system. You can add all the stuff in there. I've just put some data in there just for an example. You can download it. Link below. It'll be a Google Docs document. Hopefully this link works. And you can play with it yourself. A lot of the equations I've already figured some loss in. So it's a pretty good starter. I'm sure there's more I could have done to it. It gives us a good basic idea of what we need on our systems out on sites. I played around with it here and it seems to be fairly accurate. So you can use this tool and come up with some rough estimates and come really actually pretty close to what you need for a power system. And so that's what we're looking at for battery sizing. And originally I was going to go through all the equations that you come out with this stuff, and I didn't want to bore everybody to death. So just look at the spreadsheet and you can punch the numbers in and figure out what you would need for your off-grid system. So let's look at this same situation, same power level needs, 3 days of autonomy with a 48 volt system and what size batteries you would need at 48 volts. So for the 3 days, 72 degrees outside, your batteries are at 72 degrees. You need about 617 amp hours worth of battery. Now, if we drop that down to 32 degrees, we're going to be looking at 987 amp hours of battery. That's not too bad. Now, if we go down to 0 degrees on our batteries, we're looking at 1,375 amp hours worth of battery. And when you just say that, that looks like, well, that's totally doable. You have to remember with 48 volt battery systems though, usually to get to that 48 volt number, you're adding more batteries because either they're 2 or 6 volt cells and you're just adding them. I mean, you can use 12 volt cells too and get added up to 48 volts. But in general, what you would rather do is add 2 volt cells or 6 volt cells with more amp hour capacity. And the same thing applies for a 12 volt system. You'd probably better off to use lower voltage batteries with higher amp hour capacity rather than higher voltage and less amp hour capacity. And here's why. One string of batteries is better than multiple parallel strings in general, just because you start getting past 3 parallel strings, those ones on the outside edges usually don't get as much charge. The ones in the center get more charge and they wind up dying first. The ones on the outside usually don't take as much of the load either. So it's just better if you can keep that down to 2 or 3 parallel strings in your battery system. I hope that makes sense. So let's take the 12 volt system for example. We're talking about 2,400 amp hours worth of battery at the 72 degrees example. Well, you're not going to find a 12 volt 2,400 amp hour battery. It's impossible. And to get to, if you're using 12 volts, that means you're going to have what? At 100 amp hours apiece, 24 batteries, all in parallel with each other. Do you think all those are going to charge exactly the same? No, the ones wherever your charging is hooked up are going to take the brunt of that. They're going to get abused to no end. And even if you hook the negative and positive up on opposite ends of your string or on your bank, boy, it's just really hard to get a constant charge that's correct across 24 batteries all in parallel. It's nearly impossible. You'd have to cut each wire exactly the same length, and even then, you're not going to get a constant charge across all those batteries or discharge. So it's a terrible idea. I've done it. In the past, I've done it that way, and it's just not a good setup. A better setup would be to get a 2-volt battery that's maybe rated at, say, 700 or 800 amp hours, and form a string to create your 12 volt, and maybe another parallel string, because if you add them in series, you're adding the voltage up. You're not gaining any amp hours when you add them in series. So you create one string to get it up to 12 volts. Let's say 800 amp hours. Create the next string, 12 volts. Create 3 strings at 800 amp hours apiece, and then you parallel those 3 strings together. Then you've got 2400 amp hours. Does that make sense? Because when you add them in parallel, you're not increasing the voltage, you're increasing the amp hours. You're increasing that capacity. And when you add them in series, you're adding the voltages together. We're going to look at a Sunxtender battery like I've been using in the other examples, made by Concord, and a group 31 size battery, which is a little larger than a car battery, weighs about 70 pounds, and on a 12 volt version of that battery on the Sunxtender, it's about 105 amp hour capacity. Now, if you get that in a 2 volt version, it's about 768 amp hours of capacity. You're giving up voltage in lieu of amp hours. So why would you want to do that? Well, again, from talking before, we would avoid parallel strings if we can avoid it, especially more than 3 parallel strings. In our example of a 7.9 kilowatt hour per day system, we would need a little over 2400 amp hours of battery for 3 days of no sun. We're not going to get, with the 3 parallel strings, we're still not going to get quite to 2400 amp hours. We're going to get close though. But if we use 2 volt batteries, 6 of those batteries in one string will create 12 volts. The amp hours stay the same. Because you're adding in series, you don't increase capacity as far as amp hour capacity, you're just adding the voltage up. So you get 12 volts at 768 amp hours in one string. Do 2 more strings like that. I don't have the math figured out, but it's going to be around 2300 or 2200 and some amp hours of capacity, because once you add strings in parallel with each other, then you can start adding the capacity together. So you'll add up those 3 strings and come out, somewhere around 2200 and some amp hours of capacity in 3 strings. Close to our 2400, not quite there, but you can see the advantage of using 2 volt cells over 12 volt cells. Same thing applies to 48 volt systems. If you want to avoid parallel strings, which I highly encourage you do, you're better off to buy 2 or 6 volt batteries, add them in series to create the voltage you want, but your capacity is already there. Say you want that 3 days at the 48 volt system, I think it was around 700 amp hours. Well, you've already got a battery, a 2 volt battery, that's capable of 768 amp hours of capacity. You're going to have to add 24 of those batteries together to create that 48 volts, but it's already at your 768 amp hours that you need for 3 days at 48 volts. And while we're talking about it, amp hour capacity. Really watch when you buy batteries. Some of these guys are shysters. They will say, oh, we've got a 1000 amp hour capacity battery. What hour rating are they using? Some of these guys are extending out to like 200 hours for their usage. And what that means is there's an amp hour rating, and most companies either go by 20 or 24 hour times. So what's the amp hour capacity at 24 hours out of current draw? So it's probably easier to give an example. Here's looking at the Concord website, and let's just go through an example here. So looking at the Sunxtender site here, let's use this 7680 model, the 2 volt group 31 size cell, just for an example. And you can see out here at 24-hour rating, it's at 768 amp hours. And a quick way to figure out what they're talking about here is take the 768 and divide it by 24. So that's a constant 32 amp draw on that battery for 24 hours. We'll bring that cell down to 1.75 volts per cell. And in this case, since it's a 2 volt cell, that's the bottom edge of its voltage. Now, if you're talking about a 12 volt battery, there's 6 separate cells inside of that battery at 2 volts apiece. So that works out to 10.5 volts for a 12 volt cell. When you draw it down to 10.5 volts, that's the bottom edge of where you should ever be on that battery. You should keep it above that. That's going 100% depth of discharge on the battery, which you really shouldn't do. So again, you're going to lose about 20% right off the top here if you stay out of that bottom 20% of the depth of discharge of these batteries. So, but you can tell if you go out to 120 hours, that jumps up to 894 amp hours. Well, if you take 894 divided by 120, that's 7.45 amps of current draw, constant current draw. So you can see that they can skew the numbers quite a bit. I mean, you can extend that. I've seen some of these guys extend it way out, you know, like 400 hours or some ridiculous number, trying to make these numbers look really good. And on the inverse side, if you look at the 1 hour rate, that's only 474 amp hours. Now, mind you, that's at 1 hour, that would be 474 amps drawn off that battery for that continuous hour, and it will bring your battery voltage down to 1.75 volts per cell. So hopefully that makes some sense. Now, since I've been kind of dwelling on the AGM style of battery, there's a couple more things I want to talk about AGM batteries. Again, I'm a big fan of them because I don't like doing maintenance on batteries. But there's a couple things you really need to be aware of. AGMs are better at the low voltage situations. Gel cells, once you get them below a certain voltage, they're pretty much done. There's exceptions to that, but in general, you never want to discharge gel cells very far or you're going to have trouble. AGMs are a little better at that. The one thing that they're very susceptible to is overcharging. You overcharge AGMs and you'll more than likely destroy those batteries fairly quickly. And by overcharging, most of them, you look on the manufacturer's website and it will tell you what that charge level is. Never exceed whatever voltage. In general, AGMs are about 14.2 to 14.3 volts. You don't want to exceed that. If you do, you're asking for all kinds of problems. Your batteries will all of a sudden have no capacity to them. And believe me, I've ruined several sets by forgetting to turn on my dump load for a wind generator, for instance. And once it reaches that 14.2, 14.3 area, and you start getting excessive charging, it does not take long at all to destroy that set of batteries. So be careful with them. The other thing with AGM batteries is they're generally more expensive than a flooded battery and shorter lifespan. I think I mentioned that on the earlier video. In general terms, they're a little bit shorter lifespan than a flooded cell and also more expensive. So if you've got the ability to maintain the batteries and you're an off-grid guy and you've got the time to mess with it, flooded's probably the way to go. All the same information still applies. Whatever brand of battery you're looking at, all this information is available on the website for that manufacturer, and you can figure all these values out for yourself. I'm just using the Concord extender because I'm familiar with it and it's pretty easy to work with, and Concord's got all their information really accessible on their website. So The other thing I mentioned was depth of discharge. And what the heck am I talking about? Well, say you've got a 100 amp hour capacity battery. Well, you'd want to stay away from that bottom 20% of that. So you've actually got about an 80 amp hour battery, because you want to keep that voltage up on the battery, because there's also what's known as state of charge. What's the state of charge of that battery? This is something that's a little difficult to determine sometimes. You cannot test it while the battery's under load. So how do you do it? You have to disconnect the battery from, whatever state it's at. Let it sit for several hours, at least several hours. Some manufacturers recommend 8 hours, 12 hours. Let that battery sit there. I've even seen some of the manufacturers recommend 24 hours before checking the battery voltage. So you go back and you check the voltage. Say it's at 12.5 volts. And most of the manufacturers will give you a chart and will explain what the state of charge of that battery is at that point. So state of charge and depth of discharge are connected, but they're kind of hard to judge if the battery's under load. You can watch your meter at while your system's under load and kind of determine roughly what your state of charge is and figure out where you're at on that depth of discharge chart. And again, most manufacturers have this. Concord's really good about their site. All the manuals and information are really accessible, and their charts are pretty easy to follow. So you can kind of judge, and if you get to know your system, you can try this several times. Say you bring your battery voltage down to 11.9 while it's under load, and you just stop right there, disconnect the draw from those batteries, don't let them charge, just let them sit for several hours, and then check the voltage. That will give you a good, state of charge at that point. And say it's at 11.9 under load, and you check it 5 hours later, and it's at 12.3. Well, there's about a 0.4 difference between then those two, under load and actual just stable battery voltage. I suggest doing that at several points. If you're really concerned about it, you can kind of make yourself a chart and say, okay, well, if I'm at, whatever, 11.8 under load, whatever load that's normal for your system, and then I let that battery sit for a few hours, what's the real voltage state of charge of that battery? You can kind of make yourself a little cheat sheet to figure out where you're at to avoid going down into that last 20% of your depth of discharge. Because like I said, if you start dipping down into that depth of discharge below 80%, again, here's that chart. You can see your lifespan of the battery drastically drops off. And if you get down to where you're down around 10.5 volts on a battery, boy, you're in serious trouble. That battery's, I can guarantee that battery's going to die on you way before. And when I say battery, I'm talking about the battery bank. That bank is going to give you problems if you start dipping it down like that. And I've seen several videos on YouTube. These guys, off-gridders that go out and don't catch their battery voltages drop because they've got a constant load on it and they've had very little sun during the day and it's night and their alarm goes off that, hey, the battery voltage, it's usually on the inverter or something, starts alarming that, hey, the battery voltage is too low. Well, by that point, you've dipped well down below that 80% level. And it doesn't take that many times to start really drastically reducing the lifespan of your batteries. If you do it once in a while, when I mean once in a while, I mean like maybe three times a year, you're probably okay. But if you start dropping it down to where your battery voltage is, even under load, 10.5 volts, down in that area, boy, trust me, you're going to have problems with that battery bank. Now, another thing to consider on your batteries is the charge rate of a battery system. Again, this is manufacturer dependent. Each battery company is different on what they recommend for charging rates. Some companies are whatever the amp hour capacity of your battery is, divided by 5. So just an example, 1,000 amp hour capacity, divide by 5, you can charge that bank at 200 amp hours, or 200 amps, sorry. 200 amps charging on that battery bank. Some companies are even less. I've seen some of them down, like divide by 10 is the maximum. So in that case, you'd only be able to charge that bank at 100 amps. So be careful when you're sizing your solar system to match this, that if you want to have a quick recovery time, that you've got batteries that can handle a quick recovery for the size of your system. Now, in the example of Sunxtender, they're kind of the oddball of the group. And I actually called the company on this because every class I've been to said divide by 5 and that's how much you can charge. And their site is actually times 5. So say you've got a 100 amp hour battery. According to their site, you can times that by 5 and that's how much current you can put into that battery. So 500 amps is what they're saying their batteries can handle. And I wasn't sure about it. I thought that had to be a misprint. So I called the company and said, hey, is this right? And they assured me it was. They said that their batteries are built to withstand high charge currents, which really surprised me on a solar battery being able to do that. Now, I suppose if you charge that battery at 500 amps, it's not going to take very long to go from, say, 11 volts up to the full voltage that that battery is capable of rather quickly. And as the battery voltage comes off, the current's going to taper off anyway, unless you're putting a huge amount of voltage into it. As that battery voltage comes up, the current generally drops off. So it's probably not going to charge at 500 amps for very long. I'd say probably under a couple minutes, and it's going to start tapering itself off. So I don't know. On that system, I'd be more inclined to, if you got a 1,000 amp hour system, maybe a 1-to-1. You can charge it at 1,000 amps. Even then, 1,000 amps, whoa, that would be crazy, especially on a solar system. So anyway, check the manufacturer, whatever battery manufacturer you decide to go with, check those specs pretty close to make sure you're not exceeding the capacity, the charging capacity of that battery. Like I said, most of them are divide by 5, divide by 10. I even seen one company out there, and I don't remember which one it was, and it might have been a gel cell. It was divide by 20. Keep that in mind when you're designing your system. There's an amount that you can charge those batteries at safely and stay at or under that limit. You can go download, link below, the document that I use to kind of size solar systems. You can download that and play with these numbers a little bit. You'll see one thing on there, PSH, which is peak sunlight hours. And there's a site, which I'm going to link below. Find a city that's close to yours, and you can kind of roughly guess the different times of year for those peak sunlight hours. Obviously, December's far less than middle of June if you're in the northern hemisphere. So link below to that site. I don't know if it's got anything outside of the US or not, but it's a pretty good resource. Again, it doesn't have all that many cities, but you can find one fairly close to you and kind of get a rough estimate. And again, when you base or size your system, base it on the worst possible scenario. Usually that's going to be winter, unless you've got some kind of high load in the summer that you have to contend with. A lot of times it's going to be winter, and figure that peak sunlight hours into that equation, because some areas will get a little more sun at different times of the year. Because if I remember right, I could be mistaken on this, this takes into account weather factors too. So again, not 100% positive on that, but the other thing on that peak sunlight hours, and I'll cover this on the solar panel series a little bit more, is it also takes into account that when it's low on the horizon, you're maybe only getting 20% of the sun's capacity, whereas high noon you're getting nearly 100%. So it takes all that into account when it figures this. Let's say say like this area, this time of year, it's about 4 hours of peak sunlight hours every day. Well, it's taking into account that when it's at the two horizons, you're only getting a certain percentage, and they just add those percentage every hour. So they just add that percentage up for every hour to come up with, how many ever hours you have in a day at your location. So really good resource. Figure it into your equation. Again, make your battery size match your worst case scenario. And you may decide that I'm going to have to run a generator quite often these 3 months of the year or whatever, or times that I have a high usage, I'm just going to have to resort to a generator, which is okay. But if you're wanting to, you know, I've heard it multiple times, oh, I'm 100% off grid, don't depend on anybody, which is completely false. You're always depending on somebody when you're off grid. They may not be able to come help you like the power company could, but when you need batteries, you don't make those yourself. When you need solar panels in general, you're not making those yourself. Solar chargers, the same way. You're depending on somebody else for all that material. You're just implementing that material. So when it comes time to repair, replace, maintain, you're still depending on somebody else. So you're not 100% independent. Well, with all that said, I'm going to kind of wrap the battery part of this up. And again, there's a big topic. You could spend a lot of time going through all of this and still not cover it. Most of the classes I've went to, it seems like they wind up revolving around the storage solutions, which are batteries. So again, you could spend a lot of time discussing this, but for right now, for a YouTube video, that's about all I'm going to get into. The next part in this series will be on the actual solar array or photovoltaic array, and maybe a little bit of wind mixed into that, and how to size that for your battery system, because that's really what it boils down to. If you're living off grid, you've got to be able to charge that battery system you have in a timely manner, but still within the capacity of your batteries. So we'll look at that. Again, the spreadsheet kind of dives into that. So again, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys on the next video.